I remember the first morning I noticed the shift, an odd, unnameable tension in my chest, like my reflection had started whispering secrets I wasn't ready to hear. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old books, the hum of the city seeping through the blinds, but my eyes weren't on anything around me. They were fixed on the way my hands moved over my own body, tentative, as if learning the landscape for the first time. There was curiosity, yes, but underneath it, a quieter, heavier awareness. I was no longer entirely who I thought I had been. I had always believed that identity was tidy, almost mathematical, the sum of habits, preferences, and social roles neatly arranged. I hadn't realized how fragile that illusion was until the day I found myself standing in front of a mirror that seemed more like a lens than glass. My clothes felt suddenly foreign, the cotton of my shirt rough where it had once been comforting, and the weight of my chest and shoulders made me aware of angles and lines I'd never noticed. I didn't think, at first, about what it meant to feel this way, only that it demanded attention, as if the world itself was insisting I reconsider my place in it. The change didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It was in the small things, the subtle tilt of my voice when I spoke to a friend, the way I paused longer than necessary before choosing a word, the unconscious smoothing of my hair in public. Each action, each hesitation, carried a weight that felt heavier than the previous day, yet lighter than the fear that might follow if anyone noticed. I felt caught between two selves, the one everyone knew, and the one that had quietly been waiting in the shadow of my mind, hoping for acknowledgement. I began to experiment, carefully, almost ritualistically. Dressing differently at home first, adjusting my movements, my posture, the way I breathed. There was a strange thrill in testing boundaries, not for rebellion or pleasure, but for understanding. I wanted to know what it felt like to inhabit another perspective fully, to feel the friction between expectation and truth. And yet, I was also painfully aware of the responsibility this curiosity carried, how any misstep might harm relationships, misunderstandings that couldn't easily be corrected, the unspoken judgments lurking just out of sight. The first time I wore something undeniably feminine, it was a borrowed cardigan, soft and neutral in color, but somehow it carried an enormous weight. The fabric brushed against my skin differently than I expected, and I realized, with a quiet astonishment, that it wasn't about the cardigan itself, it was about acknowledgement. I was acknowledging a part of myself I hadn't let exist openly, and the simple act made my heart both ache and swell. I could feel the tension of centuries of assumptions pressing against my consciousness, yet there was clarity in that pressure, a guide to the complexity of who I might become. I think the hardest part wasn't the clothes or the mirror. It was the moral reckoning that followed, the careful negotiation of honesty with myself versus the safety of remaining invisible. How could I pursue this transformation without deceiving the people I loved, or losing the version of myself I had grown familiar with? And yet, hiding felt like another kind of dishonesty, one that gnawed at the edges of my conscience. It became clear that change wasn't simply a matter of appearance, it was a test of empathy, of patience, and of integrity. Every evening, I wrote in a notebook no one would ever see. Thoughts poured out in unstructured sentences, fragments of reflection, sketches of emotions I hadn't named. I asked myself questions I wasn't sure I had the courage to answer. Who am I if I strip away what the world expects of me? What responsibilities do I owe to myself and others in living truthfully? And, most frightening of all, what happens if this self I am discovering cannot be reconciled with the life I already lead? The pen felt like a lifeline, a way to anchor myself as the familiar ground shifted beneath my feet. Even in those early days, I could sense the transformation unfolding not just outwardly, but inwardly. I was learning to inhabit complexity, to recognize contradictions without panicking, to feel both fear and hope simultaneously. It was as though my mind and body were negotiating a delicate truce, a careful rearrangement of priorities, desires, and self-understanding. And with that negotiation came a fragile exhilaration, the awareness that life is far richer and far harder than the rigid identity I had once assumed. The days that followed were a slow, almost imperceptible stretching of reality, a bending of the familiar into something both uncomfortable and luminous. I started noticing how small details could feel monumental, the weight of my hair brushing against my collarbone, the subtle sway of my hips when I walked, the way my hands seemed to find a different rhythm when they weren't confined to the familiar gestures of my old life. There was no grand revelation, no instant catharsis, only the patient accumulation of awareness that I was moving through the world in a body that no longer fit the narrative I had been telling myself for decades. I became acutely aware of the gaze of others, not in a prurient or shameful sense, but as an ever-present barometer of social expectation. Even strangers in passing, the clerk at the corner store, the barista who smiled automatically at me, the neighbor who waved politely, elicited a subtle tension in my chest. I had always been sensitive to social cues, but now it was heightened. Every glance, every half-smile carried a potential judgment or assumption, and I had to learn to navigate that awareness without letting it collapse me into fear. Some days I succeeded, walking with a quiet dignity that surprised me. Other days, I recoiled, retreating into my apartment, ashamed of the nervous tremor in my voice or the misstep in my gait. I began keeping a kind of mental journal, not in writing this time, but in attentive observation. I studied myself in the mirror for long periods, not for vanity but for comprehension, how my expression shifted when I smiled, how my posture changed when I attempted to embody a version of myself that felt truthful yet socially legible. There was an education in each small experiment. I learned the language of my own body, and with it came insights I hadn't anticipated. My hands, once instruments of routine, became delicate tools for exploration. My voice, which I had taken for granted, demanded negotiation, a careful calibration between the sound I produced and the person I knew myself to be inside. The moral questions grew sharper, almost unbearably so. Could I be honest with those closest to me without causing harm? How much of my transformation belonged to me alone, and how much carried consequences for friends, colleagues, or family who would see me differently? I feared that embracing this part of myself could fracture relationships that had long been comfortable, even sacred. I questioned whether the pursuit of self-expression could ever be morally neutral. Every decision became a balancing act, the desire for authenticity against the potential pain it might inflict on others, the temptation to retreat versus the imperative to be seen, even if imperfectly understood. I started venturing further into public spaces, cautiously at first, testing the waters of interaction. The first outing, a short walk to the bookstore, was a revelation. I felt my heart race in the familiar rhythm of anxiety, yet there was a profound sweetness in simply existing in a form that resonated with my internal truth. People treated me as they always had, mostly indifferent, sometimes politely curious, and yet the awareness of myself in that environment was transformed. I noticed how my body occupied space differently, how my choices in movement and posture communicated a story I hadn't intended, but one that felt undeniably authentic. The world was both unchanged and profoundly new, a paradox I had not expected to experience so acutely. One evening, as rain tapped lightly against the window, I tried on my first complete outfit, a modest dress, simple in cut, soft in texture, paired with a cardigan and low shoes. Alone in my apartment, I studied myself in the mirror for nearly an hour. It wasn't about beauty, it was about recognition. For the first time, I felt the subtle alignment of my internal and external selves, a quiet acknowledgement that I was stepping into a space I had long denied. And yet, even in that moment, fear lingered like a shadow, fear of judgment, fear of misunderstanding, fear of losing parts of myself that I wasn't ready to relinquish. The transformation, I realized, was as much psychological as it was external. It demanded patience, humility, and an unflinching willingness to confront both the light and the shadow within me. Family became a delicate terrain. I thought about telling them, rehearsing words in my mind, imagining responses ranging from gentle curiosity to outright rejection. The idea of sharing my journey filled me with both longing and dread. I wanted their understanding, their support, yet I also feared that transparency might disrupt the equilibrium of our relationships, that it might force them to confront truths about me they had never considered. And so I paused, weighing the moral implications of silence versus revelation, recognizing that inaction could carry consequences as profound as any spoken confession. I started to notice the subtleties of social performance, the way people unconsciously enforce norms, and how much energy I had invested in conforming without thought. I saw the invisible scaffolding of expectation everywhere, in offices, cafes, streets, even in my friends' casual remarks. At times it felt oppressive, at others, it was instructive, a guide to navigating public spaces without betraying the truth of my experience. I began to understand that transformation isn't merely about changing how one appears, but about learning the language of society and finding ways to exist within it without self-betrayal. The solitude of my apartment became a laboratory for self-discovery. I experimented with posture, gestures, voice, and even the subtle rhythm of walking. I paid attention to how each element influenced my sense of self and my perception by others. I discovered that authenticity wasn't a static state but a practice, a series of conscious choices made moment by moment. Some experiments failed, my voice faltered, my movements felt awkward, my confidence wavered, but each misstep offered insight, a lesson in patience and resilience. I began to see transformation not as a destination, but as a living, evolving process that demanded both courage and compassion for oneself. Evenings were often the hardest. Alone with my thoughts, I confronted the deep anxiety that accompanied change. I questioned whether I was being selfish, whether my pursuit of personal truth might inadvertently hurt those around me. And yet, in the quiet reflection, I also recognized that denying myself this exploration was another form of harm, not to others, but to my own sense of integrity. I began to understand that moral responsibility is rarely a matter of clear choices, it is a negotiation, a continuous balancing of truth, empathy, and accountability. Through it all, I felt a growing sense of wonder. This journey, as fraught as it was, revealed the elasticity of human identity, the capacity to inhabit complexity without collapsing into fear or shame. I learned that change could be both terrifying and illuminating, that authenticity often demands courage more than skill, and that the truest insights come not from triumphs but from careful attention to the small, often unnoticed moments of life. Each day, each experiment, each hesitation carried a lesson, in empathy, in patience, in the quiet art of being truthful, even when the world seems indifferent or incomprehensible. I started to notice, more sharply than ever before, how my transformation rippled outward, not just within me but in the lives of those around me. The first time I tried to articulate even a fragment of what I was experiencing, I realized how delicate the balance was between honesty and harm. I attempted a casual comment to a friend, a trusted one, something small about trying a new style, a new approach to myself, and watched as the response carried its own weight, a pause, a carefully measured nod, a question that was polite but cautious. I realized then that disclosure is not simply about telling a truth, it is about guiding others through the uncharted terrain of your inner life, recognizing that their perception of you may be deeply entwined with assumptions they cannot easily release. Family was even more complicated. I spent long nights rehearsing sentences I was terrified to speak, trying to calibrate honesty with care, truth with patience. I imagined my parents' faces, the slight furrows of concern, the instinctive attempt to place me back into a box of familiarity. I feared that my own pursuit of understanding could be interpreted as rebellion or confusion. And yet, I could not remain entirely silent, could not continue to perform a self that felt increasingly like a mask. The moral weight of concealment pressed on me as heavily as the vulnerability of confession. I knew that to live authentically, I would have to step into discomfort, not for spectacle, not for provocation, but as a demonstration of responsibility to the person I was discovering myself to be. The first attempt at a more significant outing, beyond my apartment, beyond the bookstore, was a quiet, unassuming trip to the neighborhood cafe. I had carefully chosen my clothes, a soft, tailored sweater, jeans that felt neither foreign nor performative, and shoes that allowed me to walk without self-consciousness. Even so, each step was measured, each movement considered. I noticed the subtle ways people reacted, a double take, a smile that lingered slightly longer than usual, a tone of voice that seemed to shift without conscious intent. I recognized that these were not judgments in the abstract, but social signals, microcosms of expectation and assumption. They mattered. They demanded reflection. And they forced me to confront, again and again, the tension between who I was internally and who I appeared to be externally. One day, while arranging books in my apartment, a friend called unexpectedly. The conversation was ordinary at first, casual remarks about work, the weather, plans for the weekend. But beneath the surface, I felt a subtle test of boundaries, an unspoken negotiation of familiarity and perception. When I carefully slipped in a remark about experimenting with my appearance, I sensed a pause on the other end of the line, a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and perhaps concern. I had not intended shock, only transparency. Yet the moment crystallized the complex interplay between authenticity and empathy. Even in friendship, disclosure is not neutral, it carries consequences, ripples that cannot always be anticipated, and that knowledge added a layer of responsibility I had not fully acknowledged before. I began to understand that transformation is not only personal, it is relational. Every choice I made in the external world was interpreted through the lens of social expectation, and every misstep or hesitation could unintentionally communicate messages I did not intend. I became more mindful of my posture, my voice, the cadence of my speech, even the inflection of my laughter. These were not superficial adjustments, they were gestures of care, a negotiation of presence that honored both my evolving identity and the perspectives of those around me. I learned that empathy is not just about understanding others, but also about presenting oneself in a way that allows them to understand you without undue alarm or discomfort. Work presented its own set of challenges. The office was a space built on routine, expectation, and subtle hierarchies, and I had to navigate it with an awareness I had never previously required. I experimented with small adjustments, a slightly softer tone in meetings, a gentle modulation of body language, the careful selection of clothing that allowed me to inhabit my identity without creating undue distraction. Each success, each moment of unnoticed authenticity, felt like a small triumph. Each misstep, a voice that cracked, a hand gesture that seemed foreign, was a lesson in humility and patience. I realized that transformation is not a performance to be mastered, but a continuous, mindful engagement with both self and society. There were moments of pure, unexpected beauty amidst the anxiety. I remember walking through the park one early evening, the sky brushed with shades of gold and rose, and feeling the wind against my skin. I moved with a deliberate slowness, noticing the subtle ways my body responded to motion, the way my awareness of self had sharpened without conscious effort. I passed other people, some walking dogs, others jogging, some simply sitting on benches, and I realized that I was not performing for them. I was performing for myself, yes, but more than that, I was inhabiting the full spectrum of my own humanity, observing it, accepting it, and learning from it. In that moment, the external world faded slightly, and what remained was the luminous clarity of self-recognition. At home, I developed rituals of care that extended beyond appearance. I learned to listen to my internal voice, to discern subtle emotions and fears, to recognize the signs of tension or fatigue before they became overwhelming. I journaled with greater intentionality, not simply recording events but analyzing motivations, ethical dilemmas, and emotional resonance. I began to meditate, in a sense, on the consequences of action and inaction alike, acknowledging that moral clarity is rarely instant, that it is often the result of patient reflection over time. I noticed that even small acts of self-honesty, admitting to myself that I was frightened, uncertain, or proud, carried a profound sense of moral weight. Authenticity, I realized, is inseparable from accountability. Social awareness expanded in ways I had not anticipated. I started noticing subtleties in how people navigated difference, how they reacted to behaviors or appearances that deviated from expectation. I observed microaggressions, casual dismissals, gestures of kindness, and moments of genuine understanding, and I began cataloging them in my mind, not to judge, but to learn. I recognized that my journey was not merely about my own identity, but about cultivating empathy for experiences beyond my own, about observing without judgment, about understanding the layered complexity of human perception. Each interaction, no matter how small, became a lesson in the delicate art of coexistence. The emotional stakes deepened as the weeks passed. There were nights when I could not sleep, haunted by hypothetical scenarios, a misinterpreted comment, a friend's misunderstanding, a family member's inadvertent hurt. I realized that part of transformation is living with uncertainty, with the knowledge that honesty can never guarantee comfort, and that courage is often measured not by immediate acceptance, but by the willingness to act with integrity despite potential pain. I learned that self-respect and empathy are not mutually exclusive, they are intertwined threads, woven together in the delicate tapestry of authentic life. And yet, amidst the anxiety, there was growth. I began to recognize patterns in my fear, to trace its roots, and to dismantle its assumptions gently. I discovered that vulnerability is not weakness, but a conduit to deeper connection, both with oneself and with others. I learned to negotiate the paradox of visibility, how to exist openly without violating boundaries, how to communicate identity without imposing burden. These lessons did not arrive in grand gestures, they arrived in small moments, a shared laugh with a colleague, a friend's quiet acknowledgement, the reflection of myself in the mirror after a long day, and the faint, persistent awareness that I was becoming someone I had been waiting to meet all along. There came a point when the careful separation between my private truth and my public self began to feel less like protection and more like fracture. I had grown adept at managing dual realities, one lived quietly, deliberately, in my own space, and the other navigated cautiously among coworkers, acquaintances, and family, but the effort required to maintain that divide was beginning to show. It wasn't dramatic. It was fatigue. A subtle erosion of energy that came from constant self-monitoring, from the vigilance required to remember which version of myself I was expected to present in any given moment. What surprised me most was not the exhaustion itself, but the clarity it brought. I began to recognize that the discomfort wasn't rooted in fear of rejection alone. It was rooted in a deeper ethical tension, the growing sense that I was asking others to engage with an incomplete version of me, even when they had done nothing to deserve that distance. This realization did not arrive with accusation or self-loathing. It arrived quietly, like a truth that had waited patiently for me to become ready. The first meaningful step toward greater openness happened not through a grand declaration, but through a small, intentional choice. I attended a small gathering, friends of friends, people who knew me only casually. I dressed in a way that felt honest without being declarative, choosing comfort and alignment over symbolism. I remember standing in front of the mirror beforehand, not scrutinizing details, but asking myself a single question: am I willing to be seen as I am, even if I am misunderstood? The answer was not a confident yes. It was a tentative, deliberate one. And that, I learned, was enough. The evening unfolded without incident, which in itself felt extraordinary. Conversations drifted naturally. Laughter came easily. No one asked intrusive questions. No one made assumptions out loud. And yet, beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer hiding in anticipation of discovery, I was present. Fully, imperfectly present. The difference was subtle but profound. For the first time, I felt what it meant to participate in social life without the constant internal negotiation of concealment. I realized how much of my emotional energy had been spent bracing for impact that often never came. Still, ease did not mean resolution. In quieter moments afterward, I reflected deeply on the ethics of visibility. What does it mean to take up space authentically in a world that may not yet understand you? How do you balance self-respect with social responsibility? I did not want my journey to become a burden others had to navigate without consent or context. I wanted to be accountable, not only to myself, but to the relationships I valued. This meant learning when to speak and when to listen, when to assert and when to soften, when to explain and when to simply exist without justification. Family remained the most complex terrain. The longer I waited, the heavier the silence felt, but I also understood that timing mattered. Disclosure is not merely about honesty, it is about care. I began with small shifts, allowing myself to be seen a little more clearly, resisting the urge to overcorrect or deflect. I noticed how even these subtle changes affected the dynamics: a question asked gently, a moment of hesitation, a glance that lingered longer than before. These were not confrontations. They were openings. And I learned to sit with them patiently, resisting the impulse to rush toward resolution. Internally, something else was changing as well. My relationship to my own body, once defined largely by function and habit, was becoming more attentive, more compassionate. I stopped thinking in terms of correction or disguise and began thinking in terms of stewardship. How do I care for this body in a way that honors its complexity? How do I move through the world with intention rather than defense? These questions reframed my experience entirely. Transformation ceased to feel like an act of rebellion or escape. It became an act of responsibility. I also began to confront my own assumptions about gender, about strength, about vulnerability. I realized how deeply I had internalized certain narratives about what it meant to be respectable, credible, or worthy of attention. Letting go of those assumptions was not liberating in the dramatic sense. It was disorienting. It required me to rebuild my internal compass, to define values that were chosen rather than inherited. Integrity, empathy, and self-awareness rose to the forefront, not as abstract ideals, but as daily practices. Public spaces continued to test me. There were moments of discomfort, glances that lingered too long, conversations that shifted awkwardly, silences that felt heavier than words. But there were also moments of unexpected grace, a stranger's casual kindness, a coworker's unspoken respect, a shared smile that required no explanation. I learned not to overinterpret either. Meaning, I discovered, is often something we assign long after the moment has passed. Learning to let experiences be what they were, either catastrophes nor triumphs, became a form of emotional discipline. Perhaps the most significant change was how I related to uncertainty. Earlier in the journey, uncertainty had felt like a threat, something to be resolved as quickly as possible. Now, it felt like a teacher. I learned that not knowing how others would respond, how my identity would continue to evolve, how relationships might shift, did not negate the value of the path I was on. It deepened it. Uncertainty demanded humility. It demanded patience. And it demanded a willingness to remain open even when clarity was incomplete. There were evenings when I returned home emotionally spent, not from conflict, but from growth. I would sit quietly, sometimes in the dark, allowing the day to settle. In those moments, I felt a profound sense of accountability, not guilt, but ownership. This life, this evolving self, was mine to tend carefully. No one else could do that work for me. And for the first time, that responsibility did not feel heavy. It felt earned. I began to understand that transformation is not a single arc with a clear destination. It is a continuous recalibration, a dialogue between who we have been, who we are becoming, and the world we inhabit. It asks us not for perfection, but for presence. Not for certainty, but for courage. And above all, it asks us to remain human, to allow ourselves complexity without apology, and to extend that same generosity to others. By the time I reached this point, I no longer thought of my journey as something happening to me. It was something I was actively shaping, moment by moment, choice by choice. And while fear had not disappeared, it had been recontextualized. It was no longer a warning to stop. It was a signal to proceed with care. By the time I reached what I now think of as the middle of my journey, I had stopped waiting for a moment when everything would make sense all at once. The hope for a single revelation, a sentence I could say, a look I could adopt, a truth that would settle permanently, had quietly dissolved. In its place was something less dramatic, but far more demanding, sustained attention. To my choices. To their consequences. To the way my presence shaped the emotional landscape around me. One afternoon, sitting across from a family member at a small kitchen table worn smooth by decades of use, I realized how much my understanding of honesty had changed. We were talking about something trivial at first, but beneath the surface was an awareness we both felt and neither named. I noticed how carefully I listened, how deliberately I chose my words. Not out of fear, but out of respect. I had learned that honesty without empathy can become its own kind of violence, just as silence without intention can erode trust. In that moment, I wasn't ready to explain everything, but I was ready to stop pretending that nothing had changed. That conversation did not resolve anything in the conventional sense. There were no declarations, no assurances of understanding. But when I left, I felt lighter, not because I had been fully seen, but because I had allowed myself to be partially known. I began to appreciate how trust is built not through full disclosure all at once, but through consistency, through showing up as the same person, again and again, even as that person evolves. I also started to recognize how my internal shift was influencing my values. I became more attentive to how power operates in everyday interactions, who is expected to explain themselves, who is granted the benefit of the doubt, who is allowed complexity without justification. I saw how easily people are reduced to narratives that make others comfortable, and how much courage it takes to resist that reduction without becoming hardened or defensive. These realizations didn't make me bitter. They made me careful. Careful with words. Careful with assumptions. Careful with myself. There were moments when the weight of responsibility felt almost overwhelming. I questioned whether I was asking too much of others simply by existing honestly. But over time, that question transformed. I began to see that the real burden was not authenticity, but avoidance. The strain came from trying to manage perceptions instead of cultivating understanding. Once I accepted that I could not control how everyone saw me, the pressure eased. My responsibility was no longer to be universally understood, but to act with integrity and openness where possible. Emotionally, I had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. I felt things more slowly, more deeply. I was less inclined to dismiss discomfort, mine or others, and more willing to sit with it long enough to learn something. I noticed how often I had once used certainty as a shield, how quick answers had protected me from vulnerability. Letting go of that habit felt like learning a new language, one where pauses carried as much meaning as words. Public life continued to offer quiet tests. Some days were easy. Others required resilience I hadn't known I possessed. But even on the harder days, I noticed a growing steadiness within myself. I was no longer measuring success by acceptance or failure by misunderstanding. I measured it by alignment, by whether my actions reflected my values, by whether I treated others with the same dignity I was learning to grant myself. At home, I spent more time reflecting not on who I was becoming, but on how I wanted to live. The question shifted from identity to ethics. What kind of presence did I want to be in the lives of others? How could I remain open without being fragile, firm without being closed? These questions guided me more reliably than any label or external affirmation ever had. I also confronted regret, moments in my past when I had judged too quickly, dismissed experiences I didn't understand, or benefited from assumptions I had never questioned. This reckoning was uncomfortable, but necessary. Transformation, I learned, is incomplete without accountability. It asks us not only to imagine a more authentic future, but to make peace with the person we were when we didn't yet know how. There was one evening, late and quiet, when I stood again in front of the mirror, not searching this time, but simply observing. I saw continuity where I had once only seen fracture. I saw someone still learning, still uncertain, but grounded in a sense of purpose that felt earned rather than borrowed. I realized that I was no longer trying to become someone else. I was becoming more fully myself, in a way that allowed room for others rather than pushing them away. By then, I understood that this journey was not about crossing a boundary so much as expanding a horizon. It had taught me patience, humility, and a deeper respect for the invisible struggles people carry. It had reshaped my understanding of courage, not as boldness, but as consistency, not as defiance, but as care. And perhaps most importantly, it had taught me that identity is not a possession to be defended, but a relationship to be tended, one that requires honesty, empathy, and the willingness to grow without guarantees. I used to believe that transformation announced itself, that there would be a moment when everything aligned and I could finally say, "This is who I am now," as if identity were a destination rather than a relationship. What I learned instead was quieter and more demanding. The end of becoming is not clarity, but steadiness. Not certainty, but coherence. The work did not conclude with answers. It concluded with the ability to live honestly without requiring them. The sense of urgency that once governed my days had softened into something more durable. I no longer woke up scanning myself for signs of failure or progress. I no longer treated each interaction as a referendum on my legitimacy. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms, errands, conversations, obligations, but the way I inhabited those moments had changed. I was no longer performing resilience. I was practicing it. I noticed that my inner dialogue had shifted. Where there had once been negotiation, there was now inquiry. Where there had once been judgment, there was context. I spoke to myself with a patience I had never learned before, and in doing so, I discovered how deeply I had internalized the belief that self-understanding had to be earned through struggle. Letting go of that belief did not make life easier. It made it more honest. I began to recognize that integration is not about resolving contradiction, but about holding it without fragmentation. I could honor the person I had been without feeling confined by them. I could acknowledge uncertainty without feeling erased by it. My identity no longer felt like something I had to defend against scrutiny, internal or external. It felt like something I could stand inside of, even when it was incomplete. Family relationships continued to evolve in nonlinear ways. Some conversations moved forward, others stalled, and a few retreated into silence. What changed was my response. I stopped interpreting distance as failure. I stopped assuming that understanding had to arrive on my timeline to be real. I learned that care sometimes looks like restraint, and that love does not always announce itself through affirmation. Sometimes it shows up as continued presence, even when clarity remains elusive. With friends, I noticed a different pattern emerging. The people who remained close did so not because they fully understood my journey, but because they trusted the consistency of my character. I showed up. I listened. I admitted when I didn't have language yet. Over time, that reliability mattered more than explanation. I learned that authenticity does not demand constant disclosure. It demands congruence between values, actions, and impact. Professionally and socially, I became less preoccupied with how I was perceived and more attentive to how I participated. I noticed how much energy had once been spent anticipating reaction rather than contributing meaningfully. Releasing that vigilance did not make me careless, it made me available. I engaged more thoughtfully, spoke more deliberately, and listened without rehearsing my response. I began to experience respect not as something granted conditionally, but as something cultivated through presence. There were moments, still, when discomfort surfaced unexpectedly. A comment that landed awkwardly. A silence that stretched longer than I anticipated. But these moments no longer felt like verdicts on my legitimacy. They felt like reminders of complexity. I learned to let them pass through me without becoming lodged in my sense of self. I understood now that discomfort is often a sign of growth, not error. My relationship with my body continued to evolve, not through scrutiny but through trust. I stopped asking it to justify itself. I stopped treating it as a project. I began experiencing it as a collaborator, one that carried memory, resilience, and adaptation without requiring constant commentary. This shift altered how I moved, how I rested, how I cared for myself. Self-respect became less about assertion and more about stewardship. What stayed with me most powerfully was the ethical dimension of the journey. I had learned, through lived experience, that self-acceptance is inseparable from responsibility. That becoming more oneself does not absolve one of accountability, it heightens it. I became more attentive to how my choices affected others, more willing to repair when harm occurred, and more capable of holding tension without defensiveness. Integrity stopped being an abstract value. It became a daily practice. I reflected often on the early fear that this exploration would isolate me or narrow my life. In truth, it expanded my understanding of human experience. I became more aware of the quiet negotiations people make with themselves every day, the compromises, the hopes, the unspoken questions. I understood now how rare it is to feel fully at home in one's own skin, and how much courage it takes to pursue that feeling without demanding validation. The story I once thought I was living, a story of transformation, of crossing from one state to another, revealed itself to be something else entirely. It was a story about learning how to remain present while changing. About refusing both denial and dramatization. About choosing honesty not as an act of defiance, but as an expression of care, for oneself and for the world one inhabits. I no longer measured my life by how resolved I felt. I measured it by how responsibly I lived within uncertainty. By how often I chose empathy over assumption. By whether I allowed myself and others to be unfinished without withdrawing respect. If there is a resolution here, it is not a conclusion but a posture. A willingness to continue learning without urgency. To remain open without self-erasure. To understand identity not as something to declare, but as something to live quietly, attentively, and with integrity. And in that ongoing practice, I found something deeper than certainty. I found a sense of belonging that did not depend on arrival, only on honesty, and the courage to stay present as life continues to unfold.